Follow-up question for you again.
All right, with me, you'll watch this.
Yeah, we appreciate the fact that you aren't afraid to talk about taxes, but how are you going to mobilize people? How are you going to get people behind you to get you elected and to follow you as governor? I mean,
Well, I'm going to speak the truth, and people can make that decision for themselves. People will be very clear where I stand. One of the things I'm proudest of in my previous elections is that people know where I stand. Whether it's popular or not, I take a stand. You know, I stood with the great United States Senator Paul Wellstone as 2 of 23 senators who voted against the Iraq War resolution at a time when the polls showed that 85% of the people of this state and nation supported President Bush because they wanted and thought they could believe their president. I was the only Minnesotan on Richard Nixon's enemies list. And I've learned that as I say that, now at this stage, half the people nod their head approvingly, and the other half look at me like, who is Richard Nixon? But I stand for what I believe in, and I'll say what I believe in, and then I believe if people are convinced that we need to change in direction, a fundamental, profound change as we do, that they'll support the direction I'm proposing. If they don't, they'll vote for Marty Seifert.
I just would like to remind you that we want to hear as much as we can from the candidates, so can you please hold your applause to the end? Thank you. Our next person will be Paul.
I'm Paul Sobczynski. I'm a farmer and farm organizer from southwestern Minnesota. Racism is present through all regions of Minnesota, including rural Minnesota. Immigrants working on large-scale factory farms and the food processing industry face constant discrimination. This issue really struck home to me a couple of years ago when I was president of the Higher Ed Committee, in which the DREAM Act was being considered. It was beyond belief to see the hatred in the eyes of people testifying against the opportunity for children to have financial aid to go to college. This hatred was because children being discussed were sons and daughters of immigrants. As I sat there that day, I couldn't help but remember a story my mom told me when she was a nurse in the Second World War, when she was in the South, riding a bus and having a delightful conversation with a young black girl, and the looks of hatred she got, and was eventually asked to move to the back of the bus. She said no. My mom taught me 2 things with that story: the value of human life and to stand up. So what will you do as a candidate for governor to step away from tapping people's fear and playing on divisions in our community on race? And what is your plan in talking about race to build community and hope?
Well, first of all, I supported the DREAM Act as a United States Senator, and I used the power of my person and my office throughout my career to stand up against injustice and intolerance and bigotry, and to try to communicate that to everyone else. When 15 years ago, when a couple of Somali youth were beaten on a paper route in the morning in Rochester, I went down, met with the mayor and the local government officials. I was state auditor at the time, and helped them initiate and contributed a sizable amount of my personal contribution to Not in Our Town, where they did a year-long education program involving, starting with civic leaders, but involving people throughout the community that said, we're not going to have that kind of racism and bigotry in Rochester, Minnesota. And it made a difference. The only trouble was that it wasn't sustained. It wasn't picked up by a Republican governor and administration and replicated all over this state. When a Somali woman was beaten at the Mall of America a couple of years ago when I was a U.S. Senator for her attire, I met with her family personally and conveyed as a United States Senator on behalf of the people of Minnesota my sincere apologies and expressed to her how intolerable I found that behavior. Saturday I'm going up to the Librarians Community Center, which I obtained the initial funding through a federal, they call them earmarks, censored word, but it was an earmark, in order to get that going. If you asked the people of the state who've been helped by my office in immigration matters, I heard over and over from people that they got direct assistance from my office, and that's a credit to the dedicated people who went to work with me in my office, far beyond what they were able to receive from any other congressional office. I will use the power of my personal authority, and as governor, I will use the power of my elected office to go anywhere in Minnesota where there's intolerance or bigotry or injustice, and I will speak out against it, and I will go into the schools, I'll go into the chambers of commerces, I'll go to before the press, I'll go wherever it is I can to say, not in our state. We're going to lead the way in Minnesota to show what's possible when people come together.
I have a follow-up question for you. There are acts of individual racism that happens all the time that affects communities, but a bigger part of that, there is institutional racism. There are great racial disparities within our educational system, our criminal justice system, healthcare, employment. As governor, how would you help close that gap?
Well, first of all, in my administration, I'll have a racially diverse administration. I've gone and met with Louis King, with Summit Academy to ask what I can do now, and I certainly will insist as governor that the Minnesota Department of Transportation abide by the law on the minority set-aside contracts. Right now, they are totally ignoring that. I'll sign an executive order that will require every one of my agencies to follow the law, and I will go to leaders of minority organizations and ask what else is needed, what else can I do, how else can my administration be inclusive, how can I set an example. With schools, I'm going to provide additional funding for public school education, for early childhood education. Every year I'm governor, in real dollars, no excuses, no exceptions. And I will insist that that money also be focused on further integration, further assimilation of young people who are coming often without the benefit of prior education, so they need that additional assistance.